Over the past several weeks, there has been a national discussion about the whole KAVANAUGH Blasey Ford matter, and coupled with it, the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill matter, and underlying that is the whole essence, the essence of abuse, sexual assault, and the rest of that. And many of us have processed it in one way or the other, or in both, or with some kind of mutual disdain for the whole process. As I looked at it and I saw it from my perspective as an attorney or a former attorney, both from the prospect as a prosecutor, also as a defendant, and perhaps even as a jury member or as someone who would be evaluating the charges. And so I looked at it from a whole bunch of layers. And I considered it something fairly common that people would rationally process it. And in the process of rationally processing it, they would look at both the credibility of the two people, which on the face of it wasn't all that different, but also whether or not the credibility of this person stood up or the credibility of this person stood up. And in weighing it, as if you looked at my videos, you obviously know, in weighing it, the incongruencies about Blasey Ford as to her testimony, the source of the content, the facts as it related to where, when, how, who, why. The who was the only part that seemed to fit. And the incongruities of the whole penumbra around her, having to do with the other witnesses, with her upbringing, with her lifestyle, with her yearbooks, with her close friends, and the lack of corroboration by the witnesses, even the witnesses that she cited, the lack of corroboration by her own close friend, the failure to show any kind of concurrent utterances at the time it might have happened, either by way of accusation or by way of simply telling other school kids or family members, etc., that something had happened to her, or for that matter, a change in her behavior before as against after the occurrence, which is a huge thing most people haven't talked about. Did she change her party girl behavior after this happened and not really go to beer drinking, partying situations? And the answer is no. So none of those things seem to fit, and they caused me to see the vast deterioration of her testimony. KAVANAUGH, on the other hand, had his own problems. I mean, obviously, some of his reactions weren't very good. Some of his answers seemed to be deflective, but on balance, his testimony held better than did Blasey Ford, in a rational way, at least as I saw it. So why am I talking about this? Well, I'll tell you why I'm talking about it, because over the last several days, since the vote on the KAVANAUGH matter, I have inadvertently or accidentally or even intentionally heard a number of people, in this case women, who saw the thing entirely differently from what I had seen. And as I listened to them, the first thing that I heard was, as the issue came up, and I heard it from the outset, as the issue came up about the whole KAVANAUGH Blasey Ford stuff, they jumped immediately to defense of her, accusations about him, a sense of anger and frustration about the process and how it had victimized her further, even to the point where the president's comments and or the comments of other senators offended them greatly. And at first, I have to tell you, it made me frustrated and even angry, because I couldn't understand how anybody could rationally look at what had happened, go through the processes I had, and not come to the same conclusion to which I had come. And then as I listened to it, I realized that it wasn't being processed as I had considered it needed to be at all. It was not being processed that way at all. So I started to play around with what could possibly have gone on. Let me explain first what it was I heard. I sat at a restaurant a couple days ago and I was waiting for someone to show up for lunch. And so as I sat in the booth, a couple of women came into a neighboring booth. And I'm going to, I am going to change this into a more fictional but accurate representation of what I saw, because I don't want to impose on anybody from whom I might have heard something. So these women sat down and almost they did their little hellos, and they hadn't talked to each other for years, and then immediately the KAVANAUGH Blasey Ford thing came up, and they immediately jumped into the defense of Blasey Ford and their anger and frustration about the hearing process and how it had offended them. And then first one of them disclosed that she was the subject to abuse and told a little bit about it. It was mostly physical abuse and or emotional abuse by her stepdad. The second one stepped in and said she too had been abused, that she had been molested at some level. A few days and then they went on from there to define themselves as identifying with Blasey Ford and with the whole process, and Anita Hill too, if you'd like. But they started from the standpoint that I identify with her, and it fits, and it's crazy from my perspective, or it was crazy from my initial perspective, of how it is that people jump to the conclusion, I identify with her, I believe her, she must be believed kind of narrative. And then I saw it as more congruent with the kind of approach that these people were taking. Subsequent to that, I've heard from at least 2 or 3 or 4 more people, and again, when they came to the question of Blasey Ford - KAVANAUGH, they started from the standpoint of this: I am an abused person. I appreciate that she is an abused person too. I identify myself as abused. I identify the process of the abuse. I, like her, don't remember the day or the time or the year or the month. There's some facts around it I don't remember, but I remember the person, and I remember the abuse, and I remember how it made me feel. And when I did that, I immediately jumped to, this person, immediately jumped to the defense of Blasey Ford, and then the context of the testimony and the rest of that really doesn't matter much. Once they put themselves in the place of Blasey Ford, then their visualization of KAVANAUGH as an offender, as a person who deflected and denied when he should have taken responsibility, and as a person unfit ultimately to be a justice, was an obvious conclusion to which they had come. And as I began to process it, I tried to figure out what it was that made that happen. And I did some research on it. So let me walk you through it. And I think as we do that, it makes more sense. There is a psychological principle called affect as information theory. And basically what it serves as is to give it, states that people sometimes use their mood as a basis for their response of judgment regarding a social situation. So in other words, the energetic mood or emotional recoil response that they have is their first and perhaps only filter through which they process the incoming information. The affect as information heuristic is most likely to be used in simple or poorly processed situations. And that's how it impacted me, watching it as a third party, that it seemed to be in an inadequately or cross-wired processing that came to an early an inadequate conclusion. So when processing is more elaborate, then the priming and the processing is more likely to occur. And when I went into heuristic, I wanted to figure out, it's not a word that we use every day, right? So it comes from a Greek word which means to find or discovered. And it's often called just a heuristic as opposed to a technique. And it is an imperfect, but not guaranteed to be optimal, logical, or rational response to something, but a more emotionally charged response to an immediate goal or immediate outcome. And where the heuristics are used, it often follows upon, in psychology or in psychological situations, where the person takes a look at the situation and then takes their own experience and their own response as loosely applicable to the situation in which they find themselves. And so it starts to make more sense. As a person who sees himself as having been abused identifies with this person that they see as emotionally going through the process of sharing their abuse themselves, they identify with it and they attach their outcome and their process and their determination to that situation. And so the heuristic, whether it's conscious or subconscious, it's most likely to be subconscious, is a process by which people come to conclusion which is not necessarily rational, but is akin to their own processing from their own life and their own perspective and their own background, whatever it is that's happened to it. And in psychology, these are hard-coded by evolutionary process. And people come to judgments and solve problems this way, but often on incomplete information. And not only do they use incomplete information, but they might jump past the objective information in coming to their conclusion because they're already hardwired to accept a certain situation in a certain way. And it makes perfect sense when we look at it that way. So when I went back to look at these half dozen women who all identified with having been abused, I realized that their heuristic was the technique by which they came to a conclusion had really little, if anything, to do with how they valued, measured the rational, objective qualifiers of basis of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, or validation of statements, or consistency of statements, or completeness of statements, or inconsistencies that would deteriorate the person's perspective about what had actually happened in that circumstance, because they're not valuing that circumstance. They're valuing their own. They're using their own circumstance to make a conclusion about what this outcome, this third-party outcome, must mean. And as a result of it, they have short-wired the factual determinants involved in the situation. And I have to tell you, having selected juries in the past, having looked at juries and judges process information, it was an eye-opener for me, because what it means is that my rational, logical mind thinks if I have 12 jurors, or 200 jurors, or 100 million adult jurors that are looking at a situation, many of them are not going to go through it, not going to even begin where I began. They're not going to objectively look at the factual situation at all. They are going to jump to the conclusion on the basis of their own life circumstances and the heuristic that is wired into their system, albeit not of their own doing, because they themselves have been abused, and that heuristic that was wired into their process has been there from their own terrible, horrible, detrimental experiences. And so until and unless the person gets out of, I hesitate to call this victimness, because obviously some of these people, most of them, have worked through and beyond the raw victimness of the situation, and they've moved on with their lives. But that doesn't change the way they process it when they see another situation which looks to be similar. So I thought I would share this because it, for me, explained how it is that we have come to such a huge chasm of differences about the conclusions to which people came as they processed this Blasey Ford KAVANAUGH stuff. And while it may not, for the rest of us, satisfy us that it should be, that people should feel that way, it certainly explains the emotional, the gut reaction, the response that to which many people came as a result of the whole sad, pathetic, emotional barrage that we got from Blasey Ford and from the news media and from the rest of them around it. So I hope this is in some sense helpful. It certainly shed a new light on it, and I don't know that there's any way to take a person who has conclusory process by which they took that emotional circumstance and jumped to the conclusions, and therefore the rest of the guys were bad actors. KAVANAUGH was a bad actor, the Republicans were bad actors, the president was a bad actor. I'm not sure that there's any way of backing that up and saying, well, why don't we take a look at Blasey Ford and whether or not the complaints and charges that she has brought have any validity to begin with. The fact that she is a CIA family operative, that doesn't weigh into it. The fact that she has psychological background, which uses lie detector tests and psychological modification and victim modification and programming and MK Ultra and the rest of that, and her family and her education and her PhD and the program that she's involved in all relate to that. That doesn't have anything to do with it. The fact that and this was not brought up, and it's a very big fact, and I don't know whether this would change anybody, and may be a terrible failure on the part of the Republicans, is that Blasey Ford apparently confessed or stated that she had had something like 50 or 65 sexual relationships in high school and many more after that she had basically been available in many circumstances. And I don't want to cast aspersions on her, but it dramatically changes her participation in these 4 guys, 2 girls kinds of I'm 15 and you guys are 17 and you're providing the drinks party. And it certainly doesn't excuse people for abusing her or for sexually assaulting her. I'm not saying that. But it totally changes, I think, the perspective of who she was as a teenager and how her lifestyle impacted a lot of situations, and perhaps that her own choices made it that she was not a victim at all. Not a victim at all in many situations. Now, that doesn't keep somebody, even if you're drunk, even if you're easy, even if you've had lots of boys, it doesn't keep you from being sexually assaulted. I'm not saying that. But it totally changes, I think, the whole systemic look at how do we validate this person versus how do we validate this person, and would it make a difference? I really don't know. I think that the heuristics, the identification, the validation of Blasey Ford for those people who carry the burden, the scarring of sexual abuse, sexual assault, being abused and used in situations is primal, and would anything change it? And I think on the face of it, the answer is no. So it explains what the Democrats did by drawing to those people who would react that way, and the whole dynamic of the process. It didn't make any sense to me. I thought it was a terrible process, but it makes a lot more sense to me now, because there are going to be millions of women, and perhaps many men, who are going to identify with her and with that circumstance in a primal and not necessarily rational way. That's my input. Thanks for watching. I hope this is helpful in some way.